Watch this. No way!
Hello and welcome back to the Cookie Jar Golf Podcast. I am Sam Williams and I'm joined today by Bruce Fitzpatrick.
Hello.
And we've got two guys on from Clayton, DeVries and Pont. We've got Ed Cartwright making his second appearance. Ed, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, man. Nice to speak to you.
Have you dried off yet?
Yeah, yes, I have just about dried off from a very wet afternoon at New Zealand, but I'm good now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you back on. And someone we've been really looking forward to getting on the pod for some time now, Frank Pont. Frank, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So for the benefit of our listeners, we wanted to get together with you guys and talk a little bit about Harry Colt and some of his influence across the UK and across the world in terms of golf course architecture, because it's a really good junction point, I think, for where the history of golf course architecture and where everything stems from. But before we start talking about that, I want to maybe talk a little bit about you as well first, Frank. So for the benefit of our listeners, do you want to maybe introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background in the game?
Yeah, well, I'll try to keep it brief. Basically, we have a saying in Dutch, which is, I think, 12 jobs and 13 accidents, which is, I don't know, that's probably a bad translation. But what it means is one of my big weaknesses, I usually used to get bored with what I was doing pretty quickly. The good news was I wasn't scared to do something new once in a while. I first trained as a civil engineer, worked for Royal Dutch Shell, building offshore platforms in the North Sea in the beginning. Quickly discovered I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. And I thought, what else can I do? And somebody at university said, well, why don't you go and get an MBA and do that in America? So I applied to all of them and I got accepted, to my surprise, at one of them. And I went to University of Chicago, which is one of the top schools in America. Didn't know what I wanted to do. And if you don't know what you want to do, you become a consultant. So I started off at McKinsey, which is a famous one. That was a bit too stuffy for me, and I then joined a startup, Harvard-based organization called Monitor, which was based around Mike Porter, a famous strategy prof there. Worked there for 5-6 years, then got the itch, and I got a call from London, if I wanted to be an investment banker, and I said no, and they said, why not? I said, because all investment bankers I know are assholes, and but then the person said, what are you earning now? I said, X. He said, oh, but you can earn 3X if you become an investment banker. I said, okay, well, maybe we should talk. And so I went there. Actually, when I arrived, I realized I undersold myself because everybody else was earning 5X. So, nothing has changed. I think it's a little bit more normal now. So I did that for a number of years by accident because everybody else left at the end of the time. I was head of telecoms worldwide for Deutsche, traveling all the time. I was making 250 flights a year, flying more than a pilot, which is not good for your health and not good for your mind. And I decided to stop, do something productive with my life. Didn't know what. I wanted to do something creative, but I couldn't write, I couldn't paint, I couldn't sculpt, I couldn't do anything, couldn't act. And then I saw 2 years Master of Science golf course architecture. I thought, hey, maybe I could do that. So I applied, got in, and I did an apprenticeship with David Kidd. What I did is I just wrote who are the 5 best known golf architects, or 10, and I didn't get an answer from 7. 3 replied, one of them was Kidd, within 30 minutes. And the reason why was we were both members at Macrahanish. And he said, oh, you're Macrahanish, that's cool. And you're a banker. I just sold a project to KKR founder and to Charles Schwab. And you need to tell me what I need to charge and what the deal is I need to do with them. And I said, okay. And then in return, you can be my apprentice. So that's what we did. And that's how I got started. And I'm still very grateful that he spent the time to allow me to run around his projects. That was Powerscourt in Ireland, and later on I was at Nanea in Hawaii. Then did the studies, and then I started on my own. In the end, I decided we decided not to get together because the kid was very global, and I just came from traveling 250 days a year. I didn't want to do that. Wanted to be stuck in the Netherlands, start a family, et cetera, et cetera. So I started my own company. And I was lucky because, it's tough. It's a tough business. I was good in selling because that's what I used to do as a banker. That was my main job, is trying to get business. But it was still tough to get into the golf architecture business. The lucky I had was that Holland had 8 Colt courses that nobody was taking any care of. Well, Donald Steele was, but sort of half-heartedly. And I was a member at one of them, and they kind of said, "Well, didn't you just do this study? We have this problem here. Why don't you take your thing on it? Why don't you try it?" And that's what I did. And they liked it. And then it's a small club, so the other 8, 6 others joined and said, "Hey, can you do the same stuff for us?" And then the first club and then at a certain point when I was into that 3 years, 4 years down the road, I got a call from the UK, actually from Tandridge, because they had heard my name from Henry Lord, who had written a book about Colt. And they'd asked him, "Who should we talk to when we restore our Colt course?" And he said, "Well, the usual suspects, and there's this crazy Dutch guy." And so they went like, "Oh." And I remember I was sitting with a car. It was a birthday party, and I had the car full of screaming kids on the way to the swimming pool. And there was this call. "Yeah, this is a Colt course in England, Tandridge, and we were wondering if you want to work for us." And I thought, this must be one of my friends taking a prank on me, because so I was trying to swap the kids in the back down, like, "Please be silent," But in the end, I got the job. I was lucky enough to get the job. And then from there on, it sort of mushroomed, and that's how we got there. So that was the semi-short version of how I got to where I am now.
I tell you what, Sam, you must love the fact we partnered up with all these shy retiring violets, eh? After Mike Clayton, you now get Frank Pont. There's a theme.
Exactly, well, you can see it. But it's fascinating hearing about how you've gone through so many different careers. And
can I Sam, interrupt you? One of the first things my boss in consulting told me when we went to my first client meeting, he says, "Try to blend in with the wallpaper."
They must have some very loud wallpaper in Holland, Frank.
Well, he didn't succeed, obviously, but that's what he told me. So he must have seen the same as what Ed was alluding to. Sorry for interrupting you, Sam.
No, not at all. And so you've principally been doing a lot of work across continental Europe and the UK, and a lot of that is restoring golden age golf courses, right?
Yeah. Well, it's to be honest, what you find is people who know nothing about golf always ask me, like, "So what do? Do you build new golf courses?" And you kind of go, "No, well, they don't build that many in Europe. And if you would want to build at the highest level, you basically have to be a nomad and travel all over the world." And that's something I didn't want to do when my kids were small. And we're now getting to a point where they're 11 and 14, so it's getting more manageable. If you then want to do, what's much easier. The other thing is new builds is like hunting elephants. You get one or you don't. If you don't get it, you're hungry. If you do restorations, it's like hunting rabbits. You're never going to be stuffed, but you always have something to eat. And so that's very pragmatic. And it was much easier because you make the margins in new builds are higher than in restoration and renovation. So when I got into the business, everybody in Holland, most of the other architects in Europe were just focusing on new builds because they could earn more money in that. And I actually found that restoration, you got to work on great courses. It was actually harder work because there's a lot of process involved. We discussed that earlier before the podcast on a couple of other clients, where you basically have to make people do things they don't want to do, which is a skill that not everybody has. I mean, that was me having done consulting was very useful for that part to understand how you can, it's like telling somebody you have to stop smoking. Yeah, the analysis is very easy, but getting them to actually stop smoking is hard. And it's the same with changing golf courses. Sometimes the analysis is pretty obvious. You take these trees away.
I guess it's kind of a mixture in a way, isn't it, of skills, in that you're having to do some sort of archival research in the case of a restoration, where you're having to go back and try and find some old photos or look at an architect and try and kind of find lost bunkers or lost green sites. You're also having to maybe juggle some of the practicalities of maybe drainage concerns or how the course plays. And then, as you were alluding to there, Frank, there's the political aspect as well, which is maybe trying to convince committees at golf clubs and people who have never seen the course as it was originally laid out, that it's worthwhile returning to the original architect's vision.
Yeah. It's multifaceted, and you have architects who are very talented but only have certain elements, and there are people that are very artistic but they cannot communicate, and they have a big disadvantage because they tend to be the ones who say this is how it goes and nothing else. And if they're famous enough, they can get away with it. But most people aren't famous enough. Even the famous ones aren't famous enough. And you still have to negotiate. You still have to talk with people. I don't think it's really politics. I think politics can get involved. I call it process. And it's called process consulting, which is basically understanding how most people have an aversion to change, especially if they're used to something and they like it. And if you to change it requires a certain process, which is standard psychology, how to do that. And but you have to know how to do it. And it is listening. And the trick is that in the end, it has to be their project, their restoration, their renovation. If it's my renovation, my restoration, it's not going to work. And that has to be with the greenkeeper, with the course manager. It has to be with the members. It has to be with the committee. And that's the biggest issue there, is dealing with what, with a lot of people just don't know. And I can't blame them. They just don't know enough about it. So they're, as Simpson would call it, they're ignorant. That's a strong word, but that's how he phrased it. And they're overconfident. So they think they know more and they don't know much or not enough. And that's where it comes in that you educate them. That's why I sometimes say, even though I'm not religious, but I what I do is a lot of it is missionary work. Just go out and explain, go out to a club and explain why it's important that they should, look at Blackwell. You are the proud custodians of a very special Fowler-Simpson design, which had 50 years of entropy, and that's a pity. It's like a painting you found in the attic, which is completely dirty, and you have to clean it up and bring back the old original details.
And we're kind of at Blackwell, we're not at the end of that process, but we're well through it, and you can really start to see the benefits. And you also, going back to that political point as well, or to your process point, you can start to see there's a huge amount more trust there as well, because progress drives trust and trust drives more progress, doesn't it? Whereas, it's difficult when you first get onto that wagon, because sometimes the concepts can feel really foreign. And, we've joked before with Clayton, we've talked obviously at Blackwell, Frank, when we've talked about things like tree removal and things like that. And they're big leaps of faith for people to take. But when you look at the progress there, and, Ed, you've also shared pictures of things that have been going on in New Zealand, and you just look at the progress there when you take those leaps of faith, and they're enormous, but it doesn't always make the process any easier necessarily for Greens committees and places like that. So
no, and it's exactly what you say. It's a lot of people are scared. I mean, you're on a committee, you're going to be a captain for a year. Do you want to be remembered as the one who made the big mistake?
It's better. It's easier to do nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. So in some sense, there's always this fear. And one of the biggest drawbacks that our profession has is that we don't, I think we're already in the last 5 years have made major progress in trying to visualize things for clients. And I think the next 10 to 15 years are going to be amazing. I've been reading a lot about artificial intelligence, about deep learning. And I think what's going to happen is, I think it's going to be, technology is going to allow us to do much more virtual reality. And maybe in 10 years' time, you're just going to everybody's going to strap on the virtual reality headset, and you're going to say, this is what it's going to look like. And then they go, well, where's the other tree that I like so much? But, other than that, they'll get it and they'll understand, because I think, basically people have no clue about sort of maybe the theory, but they do understand once they see it, they understand that they like it, but they're just scared. It's like, usually what happens is when you have a massive tree renovation job, like we're doing at New Zealand now, and like we've done it, and we're in the process of doing at the Addington. If you beforehand ask people, they're going to be very scared. Afterwards, when you then show it, once you've done it, they're going to go like, oh, it's not that bad. It's actually, I like it. It's, this is, I didn't know it was going to be like this.
Frank, you're defining trend. What you're doing, Frank, is defining a trend. Today, I was there with a new client of ours, and it's osmosis. So the fact that the brave people have done this, other people will be braver. That's just human psychology. And committees will go and see other things, and people will talk to, it slowly spreads. And I think that's how you evolve into trends. That's how things happen, whether it's in golf or anything else in life.
I think you're fully right. There's one more thing that's important, and we recently actually wrote that in a client how do you call it, engagement letter that we signed, and that is that you have to have a long-term commitment. These processes that we described do not work well in a hit job. Just come in and do something and go out again. And that's unfortunately how a lot of the work in the UK was done over the last, say, 20, 30 years. There were long-term relationships, but not as many as I think there should have been. And what I mean with that is that the longer you're in there and you do a good job, you have a good rapport with the client. You get to understand the client much better with every step. The client starts understanding what you're doing with every step much better, and that leads to continuous, progress. I mean, if I would have only had 2 years at Blackwell, where would we be? And Blackwell's been an interesting situation where we had a slow start. We did everything in-house. We had to teach everything. So the beginning work wasn't maybe as sophisticated as you'd like right away. But at the end, everybody learned and learned and learned. And now we're making good progress. And I think, and that's because we were committed, because there was a commitment to keep going. If we would have stopped after 2 years, and you would have brought somebody else in again who would have said, oh, let's do this, that, or the other, let's make the bunker square, or let's do, let's plant trees, or let's put a fountain in the pond, whatever, that's the problem of the UK is that, and I think that was also said on Ed's, definitely also Clayton mentioned that, but it's the problem of the short-term orientation of committees in the UK, and we're working on that. So one of the last engagement that we did is we basically said, we will work for you, but we want a commitment for 8 years.
Just buys long-term progress, doesn't it? It buys long-term buy-in to a program of activity. And last time, Ed, you were on the pod with Clayton, I think we were talking about, is it Utrecht, where you to be on the committee there, you essentially sign on to a long-term plan and developments, and you're part of the process, really. The
one that Frank's talking about is exactly the one I alluded to on the call with Clayton, on the podcast with Clayton. And it's a great I think that exactly what Mike wrote about in that article in December that had just been published before we had the podcast, that whole mindset about why British green committees, course committees are too short-termist and that's changing. I think we just got engaged by a couple more clients, and again, that's not the 2 to 3 year revolution thing. They're in the middle of changing one, and the other one already has changed to something with much more permanency and getting closer to what Frank sees on continental Europe. And I think that's great for us as service providers to that sort of governance.
I think it's a good sort of point to segue into the kind of main topic, which is really about Colt. And what you're saying in a roundabout way is increasingly more courses are starting to realize the value of their assets and their importance in kind of being good custodians for the courses they've got. And clearly Colt was the most prolific architect certainly in the UK and around Europe that ever lived. His work is everywhere. You can't miss Colt when you play courses up and down England. So I thought it'd be really interesting to kind of get your take on these things, because you play his courses really frequently, but you wouldn't necessarily, to the untrained eye, know what you're looking for. Before we kind of get talking about Colt more specifically, I guess I'm interested to get your take, Frank, as someone from Holland, to understand how you kind of look at Colt, in terms of, his legacy. What was his, is the work sort of still inspiring? Is it still relevant to today? I mean, kind of just help us summarize Colt in your eyes, really.
Well, I mean, the first thing is, Colt's legacy is amazing in that it's large and very, very high quality. Think of it. He was involved or built, around 250 golf courses, of which, I may by now have seen about half. Maybe there were 1 or 2 where I was a bit disappointed, and that was mostly because of the land or because he wasn't, there when it got built. But everything else is fun, it's good, it's solid, good routings, good strategy on most of the holes, and that's amazing. That's amazing, especially in those days where they were, it wasn't like let's get on EasyJet and spend an hour and you're in London. No, it was like, send a letter. I've read it. letters to the Kennemer, a Dutch links course near Amsterdam, where he basically saying, well, see you in a month's time. I'll be coming over with the ferry and the train, and then my regards to Mrs. and the tulips are doing very well in the garden. That's the sort of world they were in. And then to do that many courses is amazing. And so they were obviously they were very organized. And what helped was that Colt was very diligent, very how do you call it? It's kind of not maybe the nicest way to say, but he was almost boringly consistent. And that meant I think he was a very serious guy, religious, very, to the point. And that he had his principles, which if you read his writings, which are basically 3 books and a couple of articles, it's very clear what they were, and it was, and if you then if you don't see those things in his golf courses, you are absolutely sure that somebody came after him and changed it. And that makes my job as a restorer actually quite easy, because, things like, asymmetry of defense was very important for Colt. Asymmetry of defense is, think of a green, one side would always be more defended than the other if there were bunkers. Sometimes there wouldn't be bunkers, but even then the defense would be asymmetrical. If you find a green that is symmetrically defended, something strange is happening. Now, that happened when I arrived at Kennemer many years ago. I think 80% of the greens were defended with a bunker left and right. So I said, that's kind of strange. So we dove into the historical pictures, and guess what? Every 10 years, the Greens Committee added bunkers, because look, the hole's easy because it's only defended on the left side. So we have to have a bunker on the right.
And that's important, isn't it? Because it really just, kind of reinforcing your point, but that brings strategy back into the game, doesn't it? Whereas if you've got symmetrical bunkering, it's pretty penal. It's kind of really just a case of executing the shot, right?
I mean, basically, if you go through it, if you distill I basically distilled the principles of that the basic macro principles that Colt used were basically, one, work with the natural features of the site. So he was one, it sounds very obvious now, but in his time, if you'd see, he was basically almost like the first minimalist. And the reason why was that they didn't have big equipment. So he had to be a minimalist. Second, his second point was, if you're going to change things, make them look natural. Again, you think, well, of course you do that. But if you see some of the stuff that got built in the beginning of the 1900s, it was, square bunkers, triangular mounds, the craziest things. Number 3, he was very much a links man. So for him, everything had to be links. So even if you went to an inland site, it had to be a links course style. So bumper run, short grass, lots of, not big rough, et cetera, et cetera. So then his routing, he was probably one of the best routers, maybe the best router of the bunch. And what's important there is that you get variety. And variety, what all of the old architects talked about, a term which I've used in my, the first firm that I worked for, infinite variety golf. Infinite variety is what they were striving for. And that meant that if you played a course, it should play differently every day because of wind, because of conditions, because of the match play versus stroke play, whatever. And then he was very much into stimulating, the 5th point was stimulate the player to play strategically. So think. If you think on Harry Colt courses, you play better than if you do not think. 6 was, he was very much into his greens should be defended strongly, but once you're on them, it should be a 2-putt.
So not crazy greens, no kind of hidden trickery.
Yeah, he was. I guess that's where Mackenzie was more into much more undulating greens. Simpson also was more into more undulating greens. Colt did build his share of undulating greens, but typically speaking, his greens are relatively flat, but with with some smaller micro undulations. And then the final one was designed difficult for the good players and easy for the average man, or sympathetic is what he called it, not easy, sympathetic. And that's one that's also misunderstood, which is basically most of his courses, you can put Granny on it, and she can have a good time, and you can put a Tour Pro on it, and he'll have a good time.
And really, that's the essence, isn't it, of what golf course architecture, even today is striving for. Really incredible is that the profession of golf, being a golf course architect, never existed before Colt, really, essentially. And, they were professionals who laid out the courses. And, then he kind of really debut gig at Rye and goes and works at Sunningdale. And, all these things in retrospect look like kind of just like incredible moments, but really, you know, the fact that he's creating this profession and starting to consult with clubs and implementing these principles, and you just think, well, this is starting from essentially scratch because the profession never existed. Do you think those principles, Frank, kind of evolved over time? Do you think that's stuff that when you visit courses, because he had quite a long career and a fairly broad career, are these things that you think he kind of started to add into as he went? Or did you think he kind of honed his science, or do you think he sort of started out pretty much from the get-go with, you know, these are the things that I see as being the key parts of a good golf course?
Yeah, he definitely, you know, obviously he learned. He had different processes in his how do you call it, in his career, and obviously the first things that he did were probably not as good as the last things that he did, or maybe somewhere in the middle he had a peak where some of his work was best. And obviously, later in his career, he was also working with a group of people around him. What you do see is that the earlier work of Colt is sometimes somewhat crude and primitive in the terms of the shaping. To give an example, some of the back sides of greens will have sudden drop-offs that are very hard to mow. Places like Tyneside in the north and Newcastle area had it. East Devon has it on a number of greens behind it where it really drops off. Those are things that you wouldn't see as much on all later courses like the Pont or maybe Portrush is another good example, but stuff that got built later on in his career. So that's definitely the case. I do think that the basic elements were there, but some of the craftsmanship was maybe not as much there yet in the beginning, or maybe he didn't have trusted partners he could work as much with as with some of the others. Some of the as that he had later on. I mean, later on he was working with Frank Harris, and that was, you know, that made it possible for him to be less on site than that you would have expected him to have to be.
I guess he's in some ways a little bit revolutionary. If, you know, Sam makes a good point there about he's almost the first professional course architect, really, for want of a better term. I guess old Tom Morris did his fair share of designs late in the 19th century, but to take, you know, courses like Rye and Muirfield, which owe a lot to Harry Colt, they kind of fly in the face of the traditional out and back links routing that I guess a lot of Scottish courses and a lot of other old Tom designs were known for. Is that something that you say comes through on a lot of Harry Colt's courses, Frank? I know you mentioned he's probably the best router of that time period. And those two courses, for me, just having played them, stand out as being particularly like exciting in terms of how they challenge a player to think about the wind and confront different challenges from one hole to the next, rather than the traditional kind of straight out and straight back that you see in Scotland before his time.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, I think what happened was when he took golf from the links courses to the inland courses, the sites would be different. Because keep in mind, why was out and back in the links courses? Because that was the links land that was, you know, common land that was available. So basically you played it out and then until you had enough of it, or 9 holes, and then you turn around and come back. That wasn't the typical layout that you would have on an inland course. And what you then found was in the beginning at Sunningdale, even though it was an inland course and even though the site was different, he was still laying out 18 holes, which then changed when they started thinking, well, when more and more people started playing golf, if you put the curve next to it of how many people were playing golf, at a certain point in the early 1900s, the pressure on golf courses became so large that it became important to have 2 starting points. And that's where you then got the 2 loops of 9. You're coming from a site, you're coming from an area, you're coming from a position where the original golf courses were out and back because that's how the land was. It was the narrow strip between the agricultural fields and the sea that wasn't useful to anybody else, was common land, and that was being used for golf. Now, you didn't find that kind of, funny enough, the one place which has that a little bit is in Leeds, the Alwoodley has that a little bit. That's an out and back kind of, but that's rare. Most of the other sites are kind of, at least 2 loops of 9. And what you see is it's especially the older inland course that still have the out and back in it. I think Sunningdale Old All Woodley, Tyneside had that a little bit as well. And those are all the like Colt courses, around 1903, 4, 5s in that period.
I think it's a good, because you've just mentioned All Woodley, which is a good junction point, I think, for the pod. So obviously that was Mackenzie's first design, and at the time I think the committee were pretty nervous to kind of let this young guy just go completely loose on their new golf club. And Colt was there to kind of supervise and kind of put his arm around Mackenzie, for want of a better term. Mackenzie's works obviously feels like it's sort of on almost like a grander scale. Mackenzie feels like he's much more flamboyant as an architect, or certainly that's the impression you get from someone who's a non-expert like myself, because you're looking at, clearly Mackenzie's work with places like Augusta and Cypress Point and stuff. Is that a fair representation, or is that just a random point of view from an ill-informed podcast host, do you think, Frank?
Small sample bias.
It could be, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, basically the reason why Mackenzie was in America was because he got divorced and he couldn't stay in the UK anymore. I mean, that would have never happened to Colt, given the type of person that he was. Mackenzie was also very much, if Colt would say, I did this, I did X, Y, Z, I'm absolutely sure he did X, Y, Z. If Mackenzie said I did X, Y, Z, I would check it.
Really?
Yeah. And, they're very different people. I think Mackenzie was maybe slightly more artistic and in certain things. I think he learned some tricks from Simpson and the Wilder bunkering, which came up later on in his career. I think Mackenzie Colt was a very good player. Mackenzie was a very average player, but a good putter. And that's why there's an emphasis on Wilder greens with his designs, I would think. I think Mackenzie was as smart as Colt. And there was a lot of, how do you call it, respect, definitely between Colt and Mackenzie. Maybe he didn't write it down. I think Mackenzie wrote about Colt. But what we do know is that Colt paid off the debts of Mrs. Mackenzie when Mackenzie died.
Wow. So
yeah, well, that was in the Hawtree thing. And of course, that tells you a lot, because, why would Colt do that? Why would you, that there must have been respect when that happened. Or maybe he was just a very nice guy.
Yeah. So he clearly had some core values, which you alluded to earlier in the podcast, Frank, which, I guess interestingly as well, am I right in thinking he was originally a solicitor in the city prior to taking the job as the secretary at Rye. So, maybe some interesting parallels with your own career about going to the city and then moving from there onto the world of course architecture.
And maybe Bruce is going to abandon a fledgling career in law and maybe sort of double down on the golf industry. maybe he'll just go full time on Cookie Jar. Who knows?
I have a theory about this bit, because this is, I think, where Frank and I have known each other now for quite a few years, but I think we get on well because we both come out of finance. And actually, at the heart of, I ran the research department of a bank. Frank was obviously in capital markets, but actually, the fact is that in both cases, we're used to working in research-driven, process-driven. You get to you seek to solve the solution before you start trading, to use probably a bad analogy. And I think that's why we share a mindset. And actually, that's very positive, because when it comes to restorations, you've got to do the preparatory work, you've got to do the research, all the stuff we've discussed in previous conversations. And probably our background in finance might give us a bit of discipline in that area, Frank, I think.
Yeah, it's just I think it's having in my case, also an engineering background. You tend to be looking at things from a very elemental. You want to understand things. You want to understand why is it like that. And of course, sometimes, we talked about Colt. Simpson was very different. Mackenzie was different. Simpson was, very, with Simpson, you never know. If you see something crazy on a course, you never know if it was there. I mean, Simpson went on record saying, it's very important to put a really bad hole in a round just to make people realize how good the other ones are.
Which hole is that at Blackwell, out of interest?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask that.
I think I know what he's going to say.
Well, do you guys have any ideas? I mean, there's some weird holes at
7,
Blackwell.
probably. You'd say
7 would be the weird one.
Yeah, that's an awkward one, but is it a bad hole? I don't like to walk back, but then I don't like to walk back to 8. But then, to be fair, the tee in the past used to be next to the green, and you hit over the corner of the field.
Yeah. Long before any health and safety regulations, highways code or highways agencies were getting in the way. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point though, because you obviously do a lot of work on Simpson courses as well, of which Blackwell is one. Do you think that there are some significant differences between these architects? I know you mentioned with Mackenzie preferring slightly tricked up greens, whereas Colt was maybe more in favor of a safe two-putt. Are there significant differences of opinion, and I guess to what extent is there the work that you're doing now in terms of restoring courses? Are there many common themes you can really pick out that unite these architects? It seems that trying to bring strategy back is one of them, but then maybe that's quite a sort of general open-ended term. And I guess just for someone who's a bit of a lay person like myself, could you perhaps maybe help us understand some of these unifying principles that are informing your work today?
Well, what we try to do is we try to blend a number of things. We try to understand what was the guiding philosophy that the architect used to design the golf course. If there's any writings, if there's any old pictures, it will help us to understand it better, to give a sense. And the pictures are important because they, for instance, show the bunker styling. Bunker styling is a very aesthetic kind of visual thing. But sometimes Colt would write like, "This is my purpose. This is what I want to do. I want it to be, I don't know, like a short two-shotter or into the wind with a green that's higher or something like that." He would write stuff like that. I think what's important is also that what we often find is when we arrive at a golf course, it's become very difficult to play for the average man because narrow fairways, high rough, symmetrical defense, bunkering, over-treed, and those things make life very difficult for the average player, whereas they actually make it easier for the good player. So because the good player is pretty accurate and he doesn't have to think anymore because there's only one option, namely in the middle of the narrow fairway. And that's what we then start getting into, and we start introducing like short grass around greens is what I think is called an equalizer. I think what it does is it makes it harder for a good player and it makes it easier for a weaker player, which is very counterintuitive. But what happens if you introduce short grass and firm greens? The handicap of low handicappers go up and the handicaps of higher handicaps come down on a golf course. Yeah. And the reason for that is, just think of it. I mean, like, think of my mom, handicap 20 when she was still playing, handicap 22. So she just missed the green and she'd get her putter out and just putt up. And, if you're handicap 22, that's fine. But if you're Ed and you're plus something, you have to make your up and down.
You've just put some very high expectations on Ed's golf game there, Frank.
Yeah, well, he's a player. I'm a hacker. I started, unfortunately, as a hockey player, and then after that, there's no chance that you'll ever get a good golf swing. So effectively, the trick is that you try to do things that make it, that equalize it, that make it fun. Not losing a lot of golf balls on a golf course and having fun, but still also making it challenging for the good players. And that's possible. I mean, maybe not for the best of the world, but for, say, top country amateurs, yes, you can still do that.
It brings in enjoyment, though, doesn't it, back to the game as well? No one enjoys putting the ball in their pocket. No one enjoys spending time looking for a golf ball. And, round the green, short grass gives you more options as well. Yeah. And there's a lot that goes with that. And it's interesting when you think how, it's kind of linking back to the last podcast we did, Ed, where we were talking Mike and about committees. But, the fact that, low handicap golfers at the golf club, the club champion, are typically making big decisions on the future of the course. It's naturally made that kind of increasingly penal over time. And I suppose unwinding that is really the trick, and convincing a club that it's not going to make it any kind of easier necessarily. One question I've got for you, Frank, is when you go and visit all of these golf courses, particularly the Colt ones, what do you see as being like maybe the most raw Colt course? Like what's been kind of maintained to its truest kind of original intent, in your opinion? Because clearly a lot have changed quite significantly over time. Do you look at one and think, yeah, do you know what? That's probably as close to what it should be.
Well, the point is with that is usually it's good when the the less people did, the better it would be for a golf course. On the one hand, except for cutting down trees, because if you do not check the growth of trees, you clog the golf course. Yeah, it's tough to say which is like the most original Colt that I would have seen. A lot of people would expect that to be like Swinley, but they've changed quite a lot. Yeah, I'd have to. It's a good question. I think the Pont, we didn't really change too much. I think that's still pretty original. The problem is most courses do change. Most courses do change, and it's mostly when people haven't done anything really too much. That's usually a good sign. Then you're just dusting it off.
Well, Frank, I have to say, maybe the answer to that question, sorry to try and answer for you, but thinking it through might be the Addington, because it just was completely left. Yeah. It's like, you talk about paintings in the attic. This one was in the attic for a heck of a long time.
That's true, except for the trees. So if you take the tree factor out, but I was making myself too difficult. I think you're right. Addington could be one. I think Pont could be one. To be honest, place Falkenstein is another one, which is mostly there. And places where they haven't had significant upgrades, like rebuilding greens. I mean, that's where my heart sinks. We recently had a new client, a Colt client, where they had changed all the greens 10 years ago, and they're USGA greens, and a lot of what was there went away with that. That's why I'm always hoping that when people, that's where you do the missionary work. You tell people this: if you have to change a green and you have an original Colt green, survey it. Make sure you have the original survey of the green before you take it away, because then if it doesn't work out your plan, whatever you wanted to do, you can put it back in. Ed's shaking is nodding, because his home club has a similar problem where they did that to a green, and then hopefully we will have the blueprints to one day put it back. And that's people don't understand that, and that's sometimes sad. So that's why I try to explain to people: listen, do make sure you understand what you're doing before you do it. An interesting anecdote was a course that in Holland, at the beginning of my career, and I was invited to go on a course walk with the Greens chairman. His neighbor introduced me to him and walked along. And this was the Heathland course, not a Colt, but I won't mention the name. But basically after the walk, we sat down for a coffee, and the Greens chairman said, "So what do you think of it?" I said, "Well, I like the golf course. Really like this, that, and that. It's got a lot of potential." And he's like, "Oh, well, were there any things you didn't like?" I said, "Yeah, well, there were 3 things I really didn't like, which was A, B, and C." And then it was silent for about 20 seconds. He said, "We just changed those last year."
Yeah, awkward.
Yeah. At which point, of course, I did not get the job. But what happened was he stood down the year after. His neighbor became the new Greens chairman, and he hired me. So, but it's this is what you typically see. Now, was that guy a bad person? No, he just didn't have a clue. And he was literally told by another architect, "Oh, this fits with your course. This fits with your styling." It was a British style Heathland course, and basically it had American style bunkers in it. But he didn't know what an American style bunker was compared to a British style bunker.
That comes back to Clayton's point about, the custodians and who are they, and whether they're actually, whether they really are, sorry to sound pompous, but fit to be on the Green Committee.
Yeah, plus it's also a culture. As you said, even when I started in the UK, Colt wasn't that, I think the brand image of Colt and the older architects has become much more important in the UK than it was 15 years ago. And it still is less important in places like Germany and Spain and Italy and France, where they, yeah, sure, he was a famous guy, but this is a golf course. Let's just rebuild the greens and put some bunkers in. And there you really have to explain it. And luckily, even there, you're getting the first movements, but it's much more an uphill battle.
I guess, yeah. Maybe a counterpoint, which I don't necessarily agree with, would be some of these people might say, well, our golf course is almost just like art, and it's a case of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and actually you can kind of make these changes if there's enough agreement and people like them, when the reality is, you know, architects like yourself would say, well, actually, no, there are, although you can kind of play around and be creative to a certain extent, actually there are kind of guiding principles in place.
Well, yeah, I mean, Bruce, just to add to that, I mean, yes, I'm very serious, and I get very upset with some of my colleagues who pretend or do a historical analysis and then do not use any of the findings of the historical analysis at all in the work that they do. I mean, I will do many things before I will change an historic cold green. That for me is a very big step. And I don't see that with committees, and I also don't see with some of my colleagues that are, you know, just look around. I mean, how many greens are being changed on historic golf courses? And that's a pity, because it's a big step. And I think people need to realize that. It doesn't mean you can always avoid it. I mean, we're looking at a course now which has a par 3 right next to a neighbor, which is, it's just a health and safety hazard, and it will become bigger, and it will become a bigger and bigger problem. So that's a good case where you say, well, maybe we'll have to rebuild that in a different place. But it's only after you look at all the possible ways that you can avoid it. And even then you would survey it and make sure that you have it for posterity, what the design was, and maybe we'll even replicate it in a new location. But, you know, just look at some of the famous Colt courses that have been changed. I mean, you know, again, we don't have to go into names, but you know the ones. There's a famous one near London that got changed massively. You know, Northern Ireland had one that got big changes. And is that, you know, that to me, unless there are very good reasons, other than just, yeah, we're going to get a tournament this year or something like that, you're making big changes forever. Huh?
And is that the work you mentioned there about the par 3 and the health and safety issues, that kind of work there, is that what you would call renovation, where you're maybe going to keep a lot of the original blueprint, but you're saying, well, actually there are going to be our own original additions we're going to make to this thing, and actually to an certain extent we can improve upon this thing. It's not like golf course architecture and the wisdom of Harry Colt and Mackenzie, you know, that was as good as old golf course architecture is ever going to get. To a certain extent, you maybe can improve little things here and there. It's just not a brand new build. It's renovation.
Yeah, I think there are two things in the argument you make. Yes, sometimes you have to make, like Royal Hague is a good example. When I did it, basically what happened at Royal Hague was the greens were agronomically a mess because of, you know, long story, but basically they could not salvage them anymore. They had to rebuild them because there were clay layers from the past, et cetera, et cetera. We then looked, we had 13 original greens, and over the years they had tinkered with 5. So 3 had moved to another location, 1 was rebuilt, et cetera, et cetera. What we did there is we said, and that was done by other architects. And what we there said is, okay, the 13 original, we're just going to replicate. We're just going to, you know, replicate, except for one place where we saw there had been like some, how do you call it, consolidation of the green, where some sinkage, which basically wasn't there before. We could clearly see that was a design, you know, was a build mistake, which then led to consolidation in one green. So 13 we just replicated. The other 5 we basically said, well, they don't look at all like the other 13 because they were rebuilt by other architects who just thought, let's build a green. What we did there is we said, okay, let's try to make these greens look like the other greens. You know, they're not the same, but if you would play Royal Hague, you would probably have trouble, except for maybe one. There would be 17 greens where most people will have difficulty finding more than 1 or 2 where they say that's the one that you changed.
Mm.
And that's what I think you should be doing.
Yeah.
And do you call that renovation? Do you call it restoration? I don't really care. I think it's a renovation with a very strong input from the know-how. What you're trying to do, it's like if you had a artificial intelligence system, they would say, this is how a Harry Colt green looks like, you know, for this specific situation. That's what you're trying to do. And if people can't spot it right away, that means you've done a good job. The other thing which you said was, where I take, you know, is this, well, we can improve on it, on Colt. Well, let me be very clear. I think in the whole world at the moment, there's probably 2 architects, maybe even not 2, that could improve on Colt's work.
Do you believe that? Because I think that's interesting, the fact you said that. And I thought, similar to Bruce, and there's a lot of people that would say, I get it. Like, restore my course back to what, you know, Colt or Simpson or Mackenzie originally designed, but the game's different. Like, why can't you make it better than they did? And I'm just playing devil's advocate there. You say there's very few people.
They're two different things. They're two different things. The one thing I would tell the clubs is think very long and hard before you get somebody who says, you know, to really change your cold course. You know, I'm sure if you asked Andy Warhol if he could improve on Mona Lisa, he would tell you, yes, I can.
It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. I mean, it is, because it's this sort of philosophical discussion of, well, are they works of art? Are they kind of like archaeological discoveries or artifacts that we need to keep preserved? There's obviously it's a sport too. It's a really fascinating intersection of all these different issues that's coming together there. And I mean, I totally get your point there, Frank, when you say there's maybe two architects at the moment who could rival Harry Colt's work. And certainly something I think I've noticed more since we've been doing Cookie Jar and had the chance to chat to people like yourselves and Clayton, etc., about architecture and some of the principles, and I guess a couple of the more modern courses that I've played in recent months. Well, not that recent because of lockdown, but I noticed that actually there seems to be in this modern age where we have huge advances with earth moving equipment, etc. People seem to maybe create the 18 best individual holes and maybe not think of how the routing as a whole fits together. Whereas it doesn't seem like you get that with golden age courses because the machinery wasn't there, and so the routing was often a lot more simpler, and greens were located next to tee boxes, etc. Things like that. That's just my take, though.
I think the equipment is sort of like makeup for a lady. I mean, effectively, a lady is beautiful or not, and that doesn't depend on the makeup. The makeup can help, and that's the same with equipment. I mean, equipment can make, if you've got a great site and you spend a lot of time thinking about a good routing, you do not need a lot of equipment. And you might have an occasional blind shot if you really were minimalistic. I mean, I think, like the Pont has one hole which has two blind shots, the tee shot and the shot into the green. If Colt would have had dozers and a big digger, would he have maybe made one of those two shots non-blind? Maybe, by cutting away a hill. But in essence, the rest of the routing is not dependent on earth-moving equipment. I mean, I built a new course in flat, Swinkelse on flat farm fields. Yeah, I needed massive equipment to make it interesting because the site in itself was less exciting because we do not get to build on sites that they used to be able to build on in the past. Except for going to maybe some place in New Zealand maybe has some places. Australia still gives you once in a while a possibility, but you're really finding small places where you can still do it. They're limited.
Do you think equipment's got the potential to almost become a bit of a distraction for new builds and further work as well? It's like putting.
I had a conversation with somebody who's an extremely fine golfer. I won't mention his name, but he's a member of a top 5 club in this country, and he plays off +2. And so, and loves the game. And he's about 50 years old, and he's been around the world, played everything that matters, in my opinion. He's very well traveled. And we had exactly this conversation because we were talking about the Addington and the fact that it's a par 69, and the fact that, and he said something to me just yesterday, which has resonated in my head. And that was, and Clayton, Mr. Clayton, if you're listening to this, you're going to like this too. He said, if they roll the ball back, it's going to be so much more relevant. And I thought, well, okay, you're speaking as a +2 golfer, hits it miles, blah, blah, blah. But clearly there's only limited real estate to do so much to the Addington. It's still an amazing place. But he's right. If you were to roll the ball back, I mean, Frank, what do you think? I think it would can only enhance. And then you get into the whole situation where maybe restoring these courses as opposed to building, as Clayton was talking about, the 8,000-yard course and where we're going inevitably unless they do something, they do become more relevant, surely.
Yeah, listen, rolling back the ball is like we talked about earlier. It's the analysis is easy. I mean, basically, it's like quitting smoking. Yes, you should quit smoking. Yes, we should roll back the ball. And why is it not happening? Well, because of corporate interests, and people are afraid to do it for legal reasons. That's the only reason why it's not working. The good news is for the average player, it doesn't make any difference, because they're still, for them, the Abington is still a good course with a lot of, with enough length. But just for the elite players, it's too short, and a lot is too short. And I don't think the analysis isn't very hard.
Yeah, and I guess the difficult counterpoint there that's being raised by the likes of Scott Fawcett and Lou Stagner is that, well, actually, you just need trees. Trees are a great hazard, but as we've talked about in the past, they really don't do much for the playability of the whole from the average player's perspective, and they're also kind of often an eyesore, really. So it seems like that debate is kind of crumbling, or that argument, I should say, is crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions there.
I think increasingly the professional and elite games, at odds with the amateur game, isn't it? I think that's the increasing trend. The more and more things continue, the more and more things seem to polarize. And with that, all the stuff that we've just spent the last sort of 45 minutes or so talking about comes into force. One thing I'm curious about is, in the context of Colt, his traveling, and he partnered with a number of people over his time. So he partnered with, Allison, who from his CV looks like he really enjoyed traveling, to be honest, probably far too much. And obviously partnerships with people like Mackenzie. Colt's credited as being someone who was instrumental in the development at Pine Valley. He did work he did quite a bit of work on a couple of trips, I believe, or maybe just one trip, I'm not sure, to the United States. How much of an influence do you think he had on that kind of school of architecture out there? There's a lot written about his relationship with Donald Ross. Maybe can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think Colt made the trip before World War One, and I think if he, he's lesser known in the US than, say, Mackenzie is. And I think that's because his focus was very much on Europe. He also didn't go to Australia, and instead of him going to Australia, Mackenzie went to Australia. Allison did do some traveling, mostly to Japan, but also to America. And Morrison did a lot of travel to continental Europe. So I think by the time we get to the the highest point of Colt's career, he was getting older and more fragile. I mean, basically after 1930, he really didn't travel anymore. And which is in some sense for Colt, would have been, it would have been nice if he would have been 20 years younger when sort of the highlight of his career happened, because then he could have traveled even more. But it is as it is. I don't think his influence in America was as big as say that of Mackenzie, and that's why if you talk to Americans, they're much more, especially 10, 50 years ago, they were much more Mackenzie oriented than they were Colt. The more they travel to the UK and to Europe, and they see more of his work, the more they realize that he was very good. And very similar maybe to Donald Ross, who also has a very big portfolio of courses. Hard to tell. I think again, and the American market, of course, was very influential for a long time, especially after the war, because that's where all the new building was happening, because that's where the money was, and that's where then people like Robert Trent Jones Jr. came up, Senior came up, and with that his brand of more penal golf, and that's because there was more money in the States. I mean, if you look at what happened in Europe, and say between 45 and 60, not much happened because there was no money.
And the war, obviously would have had a huge impact, the reparations and everything around Europe, and the cost of that war would have been huge. Whereas, to a certain extent, America was able to kind of kick on from having come out of its recovery from the Great Depression, which is key.
Yeah. There's a lovely story about, I read an article about a year ago, which was all about Allison's time in Japan. And I hope it's true, but it was written, it seemed a well-researched article, which basically said that Allison was working at the time in the Midwest, and he got a telegram from Colt. I don't know if you know about this, Frank. And Colt said, "You're needed in Japan, keep going." Can you imagine, in the day of travel, keep going? So instead of coming back, he was basically sent to San Francisco, and off he went. And I think that's how he finished up in Japan the first or second time was, you're needed.
Yeah, well, I think it was a combination of that plus the fact that the crisis hit very hard, and it basically abruptly stopped any work getting done on any of the courses. And I think Japan, the crisis happened later or less to a lesser extent. So that's why there was still work there. Now you see the same, basically the number of jobs in the 1930s dropped dramatically also in the UK for Colt and his partners.
I've got a sort of parting question on the Colt topic, which would be really for our UK audience and, well, I suppose anyone really, but for people who maybe don't have that much of an interest or haven't sort of been curious enough to understand more about Colt, what would you ask them to keep an eye out for or to appreciate next time they play a Colt course that would be something they might not thought of? I guess I don't know if there's anything that stands out where you think, yeah, hell, I wish I could kind of tell people to realize this because it's like a light bulb moment.
Well, I think look at well, first of all, a typical Colt course, if you play it, how many holes did you remember? If it's a typical Colt course, and then especially, do you remember all 4 or 5 of the par threes? Basically, when he did a routing, he would first look at what are the best positions to put the par threes. So if you play a Colt course and you're underwhelmed by the par threes, something's happened.
Someone's messed it up along the line. Yeah.
Well, look at good example is Copt Heath. The 8th hole used to be a cracking par 3. Now it's a stupid par 4.
Oh yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
I mean, maybe I shouldn't be so blunt, but let's say
it's interesting because I was going to ask you.
It used to be a cracking long par 3, really excellent, and it was probably a bit difficult. Somebody didn't like it, and now they've changed it into a par 4. So that's a good example. That's one example. So that's one. How many holes do you remember? Do you like them, etc.? Does that come into your mind? The second thing would be, if you would play it more often, would you find a way to play the holes better? Is there a sort of a strategy in the holes? And the answer to that should be yes. It should be there, and there should be ways of playing it. With the asymmetry of defense that we mentioned before. Then you get things that are more for people that for us call it the detailed things like. He tended to have uneven number of bunkers around his greens, so 1, 3, 5, and that comes out of Japanese flower arrangements, where an uneven number looks more pleasing to the eye than an even number.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So I hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah. So that's what I would look at, and I think that's pretty much just play them, enjoy it, and think why. The typical thing Colt himself said. What will make, the true test of a golf course is, will it live? That's what he said, I think was the perfect quote. And what he meant with that is that I played for 20 years at Eindhoven, so not for 20 years, but for many years at Eindhoven, which was a Colt course near Eindhoven where I grew up. Little did I know it was Colt, little I know it was special. And I never was bored. And then I moved to London as a banker. And at a certain point, just because it was stressful, the job, I needed to get out and just play some golf to relax. And it was hard to join a traditional club. So I joined a new club that had won many rewards, just newly built, modern style. Played it for a year and I quit because I was bored. And again, I won't mention the name, but it was...
leaving us hanging.
Yeah, let's say it had a lot of bunkers like Tandridge, and I was bored after a year, and I was bored playing it. And I thought, okay, why am I bored playing this golf course, and why am I still excited every time I go and play Eindhoven? And the answer is short: is strategy. The difference with strategy and variety in charity is variety and strategy. Those were the two things, rather than eye candy.
And maybe this is a terribly naive or amateurish question to ask of you, Frank, and also you as well, Ed. If you were to recommend a handful or so courses designed by Harry Colt that have still remained largely intact or still remain, brilliant tests of golf in the UK and perhaps even further afield, which ones would you kind of recommend? Which ones stand out to you as your particular favorites?
Want to go first, Frank? You go first.
No, I think there are many of them. I mean, basically, the one thing I love visiting golf courses, cold courses. I mean, the one thing I would say is to any club that listens to this, if I haven't seen your course yet, I might, and there's any possibility to come and visit you, I'd love to do that. That's my kind of thing. I love going to cold courses that I haven't seen yet, because there's always something interesting, something new, and some of them are amazing that you haven't seen yet. As said, I've in the 120 cold courses I've seen, so I've kind of seen half of them so far. Maybe there's been one or two where I was disappointed, and that's very little if you think of it. Out of 120 courses, there were one or two, and they weren't bad courses, but they weren't as good as the other ones.
Yeah,
that's amazing score. That just tells you. I mean, if I go through the ones that I like, I like, which are the ones I like. I like East Devon. I like Rye. I like, pretty much a lot of them around in London are good. Obviously, Swinley's good. Sunningdale's good. Wentworth East, I like a lot. What else do we go around the London area? I mean, basically the Addington, which is half cold, is really, really cool. Tandridge is good. If you haven't seen that, it's wild. What else? I mean, there's so many.
And they all happen to be sat on very good land, don't they? And maybe there's a connection here with the land, because I mean, not always could Colt, I guess, control the land that people had selected to develop a golf course.
Tandridge is not ideal. Tandridge is not ideal for golf. I mean, Tyneside is a cool site. Is a cool golf course, even though the land is also difficult. It's sandy though. I mean, a lot of the links courses that he worked on or built are really good. I mean, there's some really cool golf courses. I mean, what's the name of it again? The one in Fort Augustus. That's another cool one. Near Loch Lomond, in the middle of nowhere. It's got sheep on the fairway.
Wow.
That's another colt that you need to see. Really cool colt, it's almost like a muni. I'm sure you had no budget to build it at all, but it's a really cool golf course as well. It's not great, but it's a really cool golf course. And I remember stuff of that I don't remember on other courses, even though the maintenance was, to say the least, average. I mean, if you have sheep running around, I mean, they had lambs that were rubbing their shoulders against the flagpoles.
All good golf courses have sheep on, in my limited experience of sheep on golf courses. Ed, how about you? Because Frank's left fairly few gaps there in Colt's CV, so you're going to have to really be on your A game here.
I'm lucky because although I've seen many less than Frank, I've seen one that he hasn't seen, and I love it. And it's not in England, but I'm a great fan of Toronto. Toronto's an amazing Colt course, which was beautifully restored by a competitor, did a great job. And the reason it's great is because it's on a very funky piece of land, number one, with some wonderful landforms, but also I can honestly say, even on the par threes, I mean, if I go to each edge of the tee, but forgetting the par threes for a minute, and they're great par threes, but on the par fours and fives, if I go down the very left edge of each fairway and I go down the right edge of every fairway, I've got totally different golf to play. And, nothing defines great courses to me. And I know this, if Clayton was here, he'd say the same thing. If Mike DeVries was with us, he'd say the same thing. About Mr. Simpson saying the middle of the fairway should never be the best place to be. But taking that to the next natural conclusion is, I think when Clayton was on, he spoke about that hole at Royal Melbourne where you can be right by a bunker, but you can go 80 yards of fairway in one direction. Every yard you go, the hole gets worse and worse and worse. Like this. That's why he loves the road hole. Well, imagine that dynamic on every single hole. I can only think of maybe one that formula doesn't work in 18, and it's unbelievably fun land. And actually, they just sent me a video of cutting down a lot of trees they've got rid of a lot of their tree problems over the winter. So of the non-British Colts, that's one I adore. If you ever get to Canada and you get a chance to play it, you must play it.
Yeah, but I mean, if you think of it, which ones should you also see? You should see Falkenstein in Germany, really, really good Colt. You should see De Pan in Holland. You should see Royal Hague, even though it's Allison, but it's really, really unique. If you're there, definitely go and see Kennemer as well. Eindhoven, there's a lot of good golf. Then if Knokke in Belgium, which is a links course, it needs to be firmed up, needs to be, it's been drifting for a long time, but I think at a certain point they'll get to their senses and get somebody involved who will bring it back to Colt. Then you have Le Touquet, which is fun. Granville in France is fun. So yeah, there's
so many
lots.
when you hear you talking about them, and Ed, like, interesting one in terms of, you know, Toronto there, because, you know, now that was something that, you know, Stanley Thompson's obviously massive in Canada in terms of his legacy of work, and I think I might be wrong, but I think a lot of that kind of stemmed, that was his home club, and the kind of Colt was kind of inspiration there. I have one last question, which is, I was just wanted to get your steer on, which was around sustainability. We get asked a lot of questions into our sort of DMs and inboxes about sustainability in golf. Am I right in saying that in the Netherlands, there's laws around using kind of artificial chemicals as part of agronomy, and there's a lot of kind of people now looking at, you know, how will sustainability be incorporated into the future of golf course management and architecture? Do you have a view on that, Frank?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, in Holland, you can't use any herbicides or pesticides or chemicals anymore. And that's actually an EU ruling. I thought that was the reason you guys quit
Might
EU.
be. I got no idea. I'll latch on to it.
Yeah, it's a bad Brexit joke. No, so effectively, we have that, and what that means is that finally members are understanding. You know, that's what's happening, is that a lot of clubs in Holland have started removing trees around greens because you can't afford that anymore. So what you're seeing is we're going to have, if you look into the future, we're going to have a lot less water on golf courses. So we're going to go back to, I remember, you know, flying above Heathrow as a banker in a holding pattern. So think of in the 90s, and looking out of my window, and I would see all these green circles and then like yellow stripes, which was, you know, all these good golf courses that weren't watering their fairways during a drought. And I think we're going to go back to that, because we're just not going to have the water anymore to irrigate fairways and everything. So you're going to have to make choices. That's point number one. Point number two is we're not going to be allowed to use things that kill bees and other insects, et cetera, which is why we can't use a lot of the herbicides, pesticides, et cetera, anymore. Yeah, you can debate if that's true or not true, but we can't use them anymore. And that means that you cannot work with grasses that are very disease, prone, like POA. And what that means is you're going to have to use other grasses, and you're going to have to not cut them too short. Otherwise, they're going to be disease prone. And, add all of that up, and that means quite a different tact to what's happening, definitely in the United States, which have gone down the track of very, very high maintenance, and, everything has to be pristine, but you're basically you've got basically the grass on the intensive care. I'm not an agronomist, but I'm kind of saying it in a crude way. And effectively what you need to do is, if you can't give them the medicine anymore, you need to make sure they're healthy enough to stay alive without the medicine. And the only way to do that is to use the right grasses, give them the optimal growing conditions, and not cut them too short. And that's the future. And that, in some sense, I remember at a certain point, I visited a course in the Bamborough Castle. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Oh, yeah.
In the Northeast. And the greenkeeper I think it was close to retirement, but he'd been there for a long time. And they did not have, believe it or not, they definitely had no fairway irrigation, but they also didn't have green irrigation. So he hand watered all his greens.
Wow.
And I remember the green chairman was asking me, should we install irrigation? And I remember looking past him, and the head greenkeeper was nodding his head like that. No, so I would say the right answer. And how did he make it work? Well, he cut his greens at higher, I think 6 millimeters, but he rolled the hell out of them. And because of that, because it was pure festuca, typical kind of grass, they were playable. They're actually fun to play. Now, I'm not saying we can do that everywhere. We can do that, but it just tells you that we're going to have to be more creative going forward.
Yeah.
And maybe they're going to find grass types that are more resistant to disease. Hopefully that will help. But I think we're going to see changes. And also in the UK, because you guys, in Holland, at least, we got so much water, we don't know what to do with it. But even we're going to have shortages of water. Well, the UK has a lot less water, and you're going to have a lot of issues going forward. So I think if I were a club in the UK, and I think a lot of them have done this already, I would be really thinking and looking at, okay, how's my irrigation, needs going to be for the next 20 years or so?
Fascinating stuff. Fascinating insight. Really enjoyed having you guys on the pod and for being so giving of your time. Ed, have you kind of got any sort of parting shots for us? And, you know, a lot of people out there really interested in your work. We were talking about that before we jumped on. What can we expect to see from CDP?
Well, frustratingly, there's a few things we can't just quite announce, but Mike DeVries is busy in the States. He's going out to Meadow Club, which is the great Mackenzie course in San Francisco. He's got some work to do out there. And he's got a couple of commissions just picked up in Michigan. In Europe, we do have a couple of UK clients, which we're just finalizing terms. And we'll be announcing that very shortly. So we're going to keep Frank very busy once travel's allowed again. We'll get you back here quickly, Frank. And obviously the big news which you very helpfully helped us to break in January about 7 Mile Beach. So we're beginning to go through logistics of 7 Mile Beach. We had quite a few team meetings to work out how many of the team are going to be down in Tasmania for how long. And we hope to get started at the end of September if COVID permits. That's the current plan. So it's busy times. And frustratingly can't say much more than that just at the minute, I'm afraid, Sam.
No, but we're you know, again, we're very keen. We're in business in the UK. We got, you know, we're very much looking forward to working long term with a lot of, you know, exciting players in the UK. And I think we've talked to a lot of people, and I think watch this space is what I would say.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Fabulous stuff. Well, guys, thanks again for joining. We've really enjoyed having you on, and we look forward to seeing you a bit more in person this year as restrictions ease.
Yeah.
And best of luck with all the projects.
Definitely, yeah.
Golf day. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Of course, yeah.
Thanks for the invite.
Absolute pleasure. Well, you know, it's a ringing endorsement for the quality of work that's happened at Blackwell, I must admit. So I think we're really excited about bringing a lot of people there, because if you haven't, for people who haven't played it, it's a fabulous place, and that for us is really
great opportunity for pod.
Synergies. Yeah.
We're going to get them turned up. We're going to cut them to about 500,000, and we're going to have them running like marble. It's going to be great fun, guys. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, we'll look forward to speaking to you soon.
This.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.